This will be your regularly scheduled reading in just a moment. I just had a scare. I checked on my phone to see how my videos were loading up, and it said deleted video, deleted video. I said, oh my God, I must have a community guideline strike already. So from now on, we're going to super edit this. We're going to edit on the fly, because we're talking about moral things here, not who done it. I'm not trying to get you to hate anybody. I'm trying to get you to look at behavior. So everybody's going to be the bad guy. How's that? The bad guy. And because it's the actions that have, it is the form and function of the science that they use that is bad. It doesn't matter who does it. Okay? Alright. Caveat over. We're going to try to do much better at editing on the fly. The bad guys with a K. The bad guys. The people they say are the good guys. You know, we're going to have to try to play it out like that. Let's see if I can get 2 chapters in. Let's see. Where was I though? Oh. Particularly interesting. That's where we were. Particularly interesting, however, was Lipton's finding that those who appeared to resist reform during their prison experience had similar characteristics. They also had the tendency toward needing to go wholeheartedly one way or the other, and, by their habitual use of denial and repression to keep themselves in check, ended up in this situation where those least threatened by the power of the brainwashing techniques actually feared they were in the most danger of capitulating to them. Although they were seemingly resistors, they were in constant struggle against the desire to capitulate. Lipton pinpointed the features which seemed to him to be characteristic of ideological totalism and necessary for the maintenance of its hold over individuals. Control over all forms of communication, mystical manipulation, totalism as a furtherance of established higher purposes. Demands for purity, creation of a cult of confession, stress on sacred sciences, unloading of language, or loading of language, what Lipton called thought-terminating cliches, putting doctrine above person, and the dispensing of existence, deciding those who have a right to exist and those who don't. Schein, Hegel, Wolff, Mirlo, and Lipton all agree that personality was an important factor in whether an individual capitulated to or resisted bad people influence. All have said, in one form or another, I should say, bad ideology with a C influence. That could be any of them, couldn't it? All have said in one form or another that those with well-integrated, stable personalities were the ones least susceptible to psychological pressure. However, Dr. William Sargent, a British psychiatrist, believes that what happened in some country with a K was just one form of the sudden conversion syndrome, the phenomenon which can be explained by physiology alone. Personality, insofar as it plays a part in Sargent's thinking, dictates not ability to resist, but length of time it takes to collapse. People of stable personality may take longer to fall, he says, but far from being immune, they are the most likely to remain faithful the longest to their newly implanted convictions. He believes that had it not been for the language difficulty and certain unsuitability of technique, the bad people with a C could certainly have won over more the soldiers. Sargent offers a package to explain what he sees as the inevitability of the conversion once the right stresses are imposed on the brain. He explains dramatic religious conversion, brainwashing or dramatic political conversion, false confessions, and psychoanalytically induced insights by physiological events to which only certain mentally ill people are immune. That's interesting. He relies for his assertions on the work of Pavlov. Unlike Mirlo, he doesn't claim that the bad people achieved what they achieved because they studied Pavlov, but he does believe that Pavlov's findings regarding reactions to stress are the key to understanding any sudden conversion, political or religious. He says, in Battle for the Mind, where he explains his theory, the political-religious struggle for the mind of man may well be won by whomever becomes most conversant with the normal and abnormal functions of the brain and is readiest to make use of the knowledge gained. Sargent's interest in the work of Pavlov stemmed from his experiments during the Second World War, treating cell-shocked soldiers. His reading of Pavlov threw light for him on why the soldiers recovered from mental breakdown if they could be induced to experience emotional discharge of an intense nature, and led him to posit that the success of religious and political conversions was based on the manipulation of the same psychological processes. In the course of his work on conditioned learning in dogs, see Chapter 4 for a full explanation of conditioning, Pavlov started to make discoveries about dogs' reactions to stress. He found that his dogs could be divided into 4 temperament types. The first 2 he called strong, excitatory, and lively, the second group being less extreme in their excitability, but both groups likely to respond to stress by showing heightened excitement and aggression. The other 2 types were more passive in their reaction. One Pavlov termed the calm imperturbable type, and the other the weak inhibitory type. This last group tended to react to stress with extreme passivity in order to avoid tension. Strong, experimental stress reduced such dogs to a state of paralysis and inhibition or blocking of brain function. However, Pavlov found the other 3 types of dogs, if exposed to more stress than they too could stand, the amounts being higher than for the weak inhibitory type, also reached a state of brain inhibition. He decided that this inhibition must therefore be a protective mechanism designed to protect the brain when the system was passed beyond all endurance. Which category a dog fell into was decided, he believed, by environmental stresses to which it had been exposed right from birth and to which it had been conditioned to react in particular ways, in accordance with its own temperament. Lively and calm, imperturbable dogs could withstand much more stress than either strong or weak excitatory types. The inhibition which occurred when all dogs had passed their limit of endurance, Pavlov called it transmarginal inhibition, had definite stages of build-up, signaled by particular abnormal behavior patterns. Pavlov found that he could induce brain inhibition by imposing 4 different types of stress and monitor the development of the abnormal behavior. To induce the intolerable stress, he would increase the voltage of electric shock applied to each dog's leg as part of its conditioning process. If the shock was too strong for its system to tolerate, the dog started to break down. Another method was to signal the arrival of the dog's food and then make them wait a long time for it to appear. The dogs reacted very quickly to waiting under stress. Thirdly, he might confuse the dogs by giving them conflicting signals, so that the dogs became uncertain what to expect. Finally, he might induce stress by physical means, such as overworking them or depriving them of food. Pavlov found that if he first wore down the dogs in one or more of these ways, new conditioned behavior patterns, such as responding to a given signal in a given way, were much easier to implant. However, whereas the weak inhibitionary type of dogs broke down much faster, they were likely to forget those new behavior patterns once they recovered. The dogs who were harder to break down were more likely to hold on to the behavior patterns a long time after. Pavlov presumed that due to temperament they held on to new patterns as tenaciously as they had once held on to their old ones. During this whole process, Pavlov isolated 3 distinct stages that led to collapse as extreme stresses mounted. First came what he termed the equivalent phase of brain activity, when a dog would react in the same way to all stimuli of whatever strength. Pavlov measured this by saliva production. One might equate this with the familiar phenomenon of a person reacting no more strongly to an important experience than to a trivial one. The exhausted woman who gives up a cup of tea and the news that she has won the football polls are met with equal mild pleasure. When exposed to even stronger sustained pressures, the dog would move into what Pavlov called paradoxical phase. Here, the brain would cease to react to strong stimuli at all, as a protective measure, while still capable of responding to mild ones. Therefore, this gave rise to a circumstance which, in humans, could be manifested as an inability to cry on hearing of the death of a loved one, but to be intensely irritated and upset by the loss of an earring. The third and final stage of brain inhibition, Pavlov calls ultra-paradoxical. Now the dog reacted with a positive response where it normally had a negative one, vice versa. For instance, it would try to elicit affectionate attention from a liberatory assistant that it had previously disliked, and attack one that it had previously been fond of. Once these 3 stages had been set in train, Pavlov noticed the dogs often behaved in a hypnoidal fashion. Sargent remarks that clinical reports of patients under hypnosis often reveal them to act in ways consistent with Pavlov's inhibition phases. Inhibition, yeah. A final unexpected discovery occurred for Pavlov when his dogs were nearly drowned during the Leningrad floods, as they were trapped in their cages. At the last minute, the laboratory system was able to rush in and save them, but the terror of the experience, a stress beyond all stresses, produced yet another brain response. The dogs forgot all that they had been taught by conditioning up until that point. That is, all of the conditioned reflexes that Pavlov had implanted in them had vanished, and it took months to restore them. Pavlov believed that the higher centers of the brain in the dogs and in humans were in a constant state of flux between excitation and inhibition. That, when one part was highly excited, the other area was inhibited as a result. For instance, a person undergoing an ecstatic experience may be temporarily oblivious to pain. He also noted that one part of the brain cortex which has been overexcited might become fixed, leading to a pattern of repetitious movements or behavior. He thought this might explain, for example, obsessional thinking. Sargent uses these findings from Pavlov to extrapolate about the mechanisms of recovery from shell shock religious conversions, and the eliciting of false confessions. He maintains that those who believe the exercise of willpower is sufficient to beat the brainwashers are sadly mistaken. Active resistance only puts more pressure on the brain and speeds breakdown. After his reading of Pavlov's work, Sargent says that he became aware how far the behavior of shell-shocked soldiers whom he had been treating at the time accorded with Pavlov's inhibition stages. Some, for instance, might be suffering severe fright paralysis of the limbs. If they tried to move them, they couldn't. But if they were thinking about something else, they were amazed to find that they could move the paralyzed limb. An example of the paradoxical stage, says Sargent. Men who came to the clinic in a state of nervous breakdown and emotional paralysis could be released from their suffering if Sargent induced an aberration, an intense emotional discharge. This might be achieved by giving them a drug to help lower their defenses and coaxing them to talk of the experience that they had had, the experience they had had and which they had, till now, repressed. If the soldiers could be drawn into the limits of their endurance in this way, they experienced a sudden, intense outpouring of their feelings and reliving of the events in question, an exhausting experience that led them finally into an emotional collapse. I wonder if I have food yet. Not yet. Okay. When they came out of it, they were like different men. They would see what had happened in perspective. They could face up to the horrors and fears that they had undergone in the trenches. The principle of emotional discharge, the release of locked-in emotions, is behind most modern psychotherapies. However, Sargent makes a significant point. The aberration should be induced even if the events being reacted to were implanted by the doctor and had never happened. Let me reread that. The aberration could be induced even if the events being reacted to were implanted by the doctor and had never happened. Reference the satanic panic. A lot of false memories were put in. For instance, the doctor might ask the patient to describe himself fighting his way out of a burning tank, and the patient would eventually experience emotional collapse, even though the event had never happened. What is vital to Sargent, therefore, is not the unblocking of repressed memories and their concomitant emotions, but the build-up of stress to its extremes by whatever means, with a view to eliciting a freeing emotional discharge. I'm not sure I agree with that. After aberration was over, the men lost their fright, paralysis, or whatever compulsive behavior pattern had been established. All that neurotic behavior had been knocked out by a collapse. Sargent sees this as akin to what happened with Pavlov's dogs. In using Pavlov's findings to explain seemingly inexplicable religious and political conversions, it's probably my food. The time difference isn't much of a difference. Okay, in using Pavlov's findings to explain seemingly inexplicable religious and political conversions, Sargent stresses the suggestibility state that is engendered as a result of extreme anxiety. He recalls how the terrors of the Blitz enabled large numbers of people to believe unlikely stories, such as the rumors following Lord Haha's broadcasts from some country that begins with a G. Sargent relates such occurrences back to Pavlov's finding that, once extreme stress was induced, the dogs could be made to give up their old conditioning in order to take on a new set of responses conditioned by the laboratory assistants. And if they were of balanced temperament, they would hold on to those new behavior patterns as firmly as they had resisted losing the old. Sargent sees this mechanism working in a revivalist meeting, where extreme emotional stress induced by the preaching, the atmosphere, the guilt and fear, led to a collapse and then adoption of the new thinking. Similarly, in some country that begins with a K, the bad people, in effect, used the same breakdown system to implant a new set of beliefs. Pure intellectual indoctrination, he says, would be useless. A proof that it is stress of any kind that is the key to conversion rather than the underlying sympathy with the new view might be, as Sargent suggests, the fact that those who attend Wesley's evangelistic meetings and were aroused to a pitch of anger and indignation at what was going on were just as likely to break down under the stress of a negative emotion and come to saved. Those who attend Wesley's evangelistic meetings were aroused to a pitch of anger and indignation at what was going on were just as likely to break down under the stress of the negative emotion and come to saved. Sargent also cites Arthur Koestler's account of the night he had made his decision to become a communist. He remained with the party 6 years. Koestler himself says that a whole series of grotesque events clinched the making of the decision, and the making of a decision he had been moving toward for some time. The events in question were a heavy hangover, a broken down car, a heavy financial loss at the poker, and a drunken sexual encounter with a person he disliked. None of these stresses were connected with or threw light on his positions in regards to communism, but they precipitated his sudden decision to join the party. Any extreme experience of emotion can make a person highly suggestible and either reverse his conditioned behavior patterns or else wipe them out altogether, according to Sargent. The degree of stress that an individual's level of ability to withstand stress, and the individual's level of ability to withstand stress will determine the actual outcome. Sargent does not claim that every single person can be brainwashed. He excludes certain categories of the mentally ill whose emotions are so impossible to arouse, or who are so disconnected from their feelings that they cannot be brought to collapse. Such people cannot be made to abstract? Yeah. In hospitals, for instance. I'm going to go. I did not make 2 chapters, but my food's coming and I'm hungry.